So thank you again for joining us this evening. This is our second event for this semester in our Day in the Life series. And the Day in the Life series started at the onset of the launch of the master's program in 2016. And we started this series so that we could invite various people in the fields of both IO psychology and developmental psychology to really talk about their paths to psychology and to their subdiscipline, their past and their current positions, and then also how all of that ties into the broader field that they sit in. So our hope is that as students, you're able to glean different paths that people come to the field so that you see that, people don't take traditional paths through, psychology undergrad, psychology grad, et cetera. And that will hopefully make you feel really good about your path and the uniqueness of that path, but also that you see that after you're done with this degree, that there are many different paths that you can take afterward. And so we want to just really open things up for you so that you see that there's really no set path in and there's really no set path out, and that you can see all of the different and unique things that you can do with a degree in psychology, whether it's IO psychology or developmental psychology. And so each semester we invite one IO psychologist and one developmental psychologist to share their experiences with you. And tonight that person is Professor Clemente Diaz. So Professor Diaz is an IO psychology practitioner with extensive experience in higher education administration. Over the past decade, he has held numerous roles in higher education, including Assistant Director of Recruiting and Operations, Chief Diversity Officer Representative, and most recently, Associate Director of College Now. And in addition to his current role, Professor Diaz has been an adjunct faculty member here at CUNY SPS since 2017, and some of you may have already had him in a class. He is also chair of the Society for IO Bridge Builders Committee, otherwise known as SIOP, and he's the co-founder of the CUNY IO Practitioners Network. He is passionate about implementing evidence-based practices in higher education administration, exposing students and educators to the field of IO psychology, and also debunking commonly held workplace and educational myths, and we know that there are many. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Professor Diaz for his presentation this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I want to thank CUNY SPS for having me today to do this talk. And then secondly, thank all of you for attending or joining us today. When it comes to IO psychology, just like any other area of psychology, there are various paths that one can take. The one that I've been fortunate enough to be in is higher education administration. And I say fortunate because there's a lot of benefits to working in the industry. So bear with me a second. I'm going to put my slide. And basically, I'm going to be talking about how is it that I got into the field. More often than not, students who pursue IO psychology, they usually think of HR or HR-related occupations. And I was kind of similar in that respect, that as I was getting my degrees or getting my education, I was thinking about HR is the way to go, and that's going to be my my career path ultimately. But life threw me a curveball, as they say, and I went a very different path, and I don't regret it one bit. So I started off by attending Baruch College, and ultimately I received a degree in psychology. But when I attended Baruch College, my goal was to focus on business. So I thought I was going to get an undergraduate degree in economics and finance. Started taking all my courses, my business-related courses, and really liked the material. I started taking courses to try and determine what my minor was going to be, because at that time at Baruch required a minor of all students. So I took psychology. I figured, it's applicable to pretty much everything. Took one course, found it very interesting, and then took another course, and it kind of went from there. I think it was around my second or third course as part of my minor that I got introduced to IO psychology, and I was like, wow, never heard of this field. Seems like a perfect blend of my interest in business and kind of this new interest that I had in psychology. So it was a perfect blend. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to change my major. I'm going to go and I'm going to pursue this degree in psychology. As anybody who's pursuing a psychology degree knows, once you make that decision and you tell your parents like, well, I'm gonna pursue a degree in psychology, the first thing they say is you're not gonna get a job. Now, that said, that's a huge misconception in the field. If you look at APA's workforce center, students who receive a bachelor's degree in psychology tend to be employed in over 92 different occupational categories. So there's a lot of opportunity when you have a degree in psychology. So as I started preparing myself, I started thinking about, what is it that I should be doing? Should I be pursuing, or should I think about pursuing a doctorate degree? Should I just go for a master's degree? What type of career path I want to pursue? I started looking at different, areas. One thing I started doing was being very involved on campus. So I held various student leadership roles from orientation leader, freshman seminar. There was a program called Peers Advocating Wellness Services, so helping kind of with mental health and physical health, things related on campus. Just, again, being very involved on campus. At some point or another, I decided to look at research internships on campus. So I had the opportunity to work with two different faculty members at Baruch, Dr. Charles Sherbaum and Dr. Lauren Naidu, both of which are IO psychologists. And I focused on different areas of IO psychology. So 1 year, I focused very heavily on leadership processes, specifically how leaders' task framing impacts group outcomes. So if the leader's pessimistic or optimistic, what impact will that have on their teams? And then secondly, I had the opportunity to do research on the adverse impact of traditional cognitive ability assessments, and then trying to verify or develop validity for an alternative assessment called the Siena reasoning test, which looked at non-entrenched tasks to determine different areas of cognitive ability. So I had these experiences, and throughout those experiences, again, in the back of my mind, I'm like, should I be going for a doctorate degree straight out of undergrad, or just pursuing a master's degree? But always in mind, thinking, I'm going to go into HR, or just going into corporate in general. As time went on, I heavily contemplated going for a doctorate degree. Still wasn't unsure if that was the path I wanted to take, if I wanted to be a researcher or a practitioner. Ultimately, I decided to pursue a master's degree and thought, maybe this will give me a little bit more time to determine whether I want kind of that research career path or not. So I ended up attending Brooklyn College for my master's in industrial organizational psychology. In terms of that opportunity, I focused on Brooklyn College for two reasons. One was I had already received my degree from Baruch College, right? And had worked very closely with faculty members. So I felt like I had a good perspective of what Baruch College would provide to me if I decided to pursue a master's degree in IO at Baruch. At that time, SPS did not have a master's program in IO, so I didn't consider SPS as an opportunity. So in terms of CUNY schools, Brooklyn College was my other opportunity. And I focused primarily on CUNY, again, because of the costs of trying to go into grad school and having to pay out of pocket. Luckily, CUNY, for those of you who are undergrads, CUNY has this program called the CUNY CAPS program. So it's a program in which students who've received an undergraduate degree at CUNY and are going to be pursuing their graduate studies at CUNY can potentially get their degrees paid for. So I was fortunate enough to get accepted into that program, and it worked beautifully. They paid for 2 courses every semester, and they also helped me find a job on a campus. So it was getting kind of hands-on experience as well as getting my tuition covered. And through that, that's kind of how I got my first foot in the door in higher education. So as I was completing my master's degree at Brooklyn College, I got the opportunity to work at the Career Development Center at Baruch College, specifically doing employee relations related aspects. I felt that, from all the opportunities that they, presenting as part of the CUNY CAP program, that was the one that at that time best aligned with IO psychology. So it was working with employers to get opportunities posted for undergraduate students to apply, helping out with corporate events, As time went on, I was given additional responsibilities, so I was able to facilitate workshops on, how do you develop your resume, networking skills, interviewing skills, and things of that nature. And eventually started doing career coaching with undergraduate students to help them land opportunities in a variety of industries. As I was in the Career Development Center, towards the latter end of my degree, I was like, all right, now here's my chance. I'm completing my degree. I have some firsthand work experience. Let me start looking into those HR opportunities and corporate. So I think my final year of my graduate degree, started applying for various opportunities in corporate and HR functions, went on interviews, would get callbacks, went on, the different training programs where, they'll interview you 6, 7 times, but ultimately didn't land anything. I didn't let that discourage me. I was like, all right, there's still time, to kind of see what was going to come of this. But during that time period, towards the very last minute, I think it was a month before I graduated from my master's program, and an assistant director position opened up in my office. And I was encouraged by numerous individuals in the office to apply for it. So I was like, why not? I'll give it a chance. I'll apply. Long story short, ended up getting the opportunity as assistant director. And that kind of cemented my career path in higher ed admin. So I have this opportunity now. I'm working very closely with employers, specifically with Baruch's on-campus recruiting program. So again, kind of working very closely with accounting and finance firms to come on campus and recruit students. During that time, I started engaging myself in other opportunities on campus. So we had an associate director in the office who had left to become the chief diversity officer for the college. And I had reached out to him like, hey, I'm doing all these, these things in the Career Development Center. Well, I want to kind of get a little bit more experience on things that I think are a bit closer to IO psychology. So I'm like, is there anything that you can do? I can volunteer my time. And that's kind of what led me to being a chief diversity officer rep for the college for a number of years. And that was an opportunity to serve on search committees for the college and making sure that the search committee process was as fair and equitable as possible. So taking into consideration whether they were state, federal, or CUNY laws as they related to affirmative action. So, and that was a real opportunity to kind of put my IO experience, apply it very concretely. What type of questions were we going to ask as a search committee for these prospective applicants, and making recommendations for second round interviews and things like that. As time went on, I stayed in higher education, obviously. Other opportunities arose. The opportunity that I kind of transitioned out of the Career Development Center was for College Now. So College Now is a dual enrollment program where we have high school students enroll in free college credit courses. So a kind of a big deviation from just career services. I applied for that opportunity mostly because I saw it as a challenge, something different, develop new skill sets. There was different technology that I would be using, having different responsibilities. And it was really around that time that my perspective began to open, and thinking about, I have this background in IO psychology. How am I going to really apply what I've learned and the experiences I've had to this new role? Because again, oftentimes as IOs coming out of grad school, we have kind of tunnel vision. HR, these are very specific areas that we're going to apply our knowledge in. But through my experience in College Now, I found a way of applying what I had learned into this new environment, to this new department. Whether it was how we were going to help better train faculty members who were in our department, ensuring that processes were effective by looking at evidence-based practices. What does the research or the data suggest? Making sure that the environment was better for my colleagues and I. And I also started looking at other opportunities as well. So another opportunity I engaged in was the Advising Alliance, which was, or it still exists. So it's a group of higher education professionals at Baruch who service students, but the alliance was designed to better prepare those administrators professionally. So it was an opportunity to kind of do training and development, helping these staff members get trained on mental health for each other, for students, and other areas that they were interested in. And that was around the time that I also started thinking about teaching. One thing that some of you may have already noticed, especially if you're in the graduate program, and if you're in the undergraduate program and you want to pursue graduate studies, you'll notice this eventually. Oftentimes, as a graduate level practitioner, not focusing on research or academia in terms of teaching and things of that nature, there tends to be a gap between what you learn as a practitioner or in your graduate program and the work that you're doing. It's very easy to fall into management fads or different things that are happening within the industry that you're in that don't necessarily align with IO theory, research, and practice, or research and evidence-based practice. So as was mentioned before, one of my passions is debunking commonly held myths within business and education, because there's plenty and it's very easy to fall into them. So I was like, what's something that I can do to make sure that this doesn't happen? And what I thought was, maybe I should start teaching, because once you're teaching, you're kind of re-engaging yourself in the material that you've learned. You're, depending on how you teach your course, you start engaging yourself in other research and newer practices, data and research that may debunk things that you've learned as an undergraduate student. One example that I'll give you is this concept of generational groups, right? Millennials, boomers, Gen X, and so forth, things that I learned as an undergrad. But when you look at the data, don't actually exist. There's no supporting evidence that these supposed groups actually exist and that there are any differences between them. So it was a great opportunity to kind of engage myself in teaching, to kind of re-solidify myself with the content, what I had learned, as well as finding a reason to further engage myself with IO research. In terms of that practitioner gap, as I mentioned before, it's very easy to fall into it. And once you graduate, sometimes it's hard to get access to research and evidence that is needed to be a good practitioner or an effective practitioner. And by working in higher education, working in teaching, you have access to all those resources that you had as an undergrad. You have access to the library, these databases that once you're outside of school are very hard to come by. And if they are accessible, there's high fees. Oftentimes you'll try to find a research article, and if you're not in higher education, it's behind a paywall, right? So either you have to pay for membership to different associations, different journals, which can be very costly at times. So once you're kind of in this industry, it makes it very easy to access those resources. So that helped kind of solidify myself in IO, and also how I could apply the content to this new environment, this new work experience. Soon after, I started teaching at CUNY SPS. And that transition primarily occurred because, my wife and I ended up having a son, and I needed more flexibility. So at Baruch, I was primarily teaching in-person courses, and I would start teaching either during the day and kind of have to adjust my work schedule. And SPS really gave me the opportunity to have a more flexible work schedule when it came to teaching, but also eventually have the opportunity to start teaching online courses, which was extremely flexible for my schedule. And again, a way to continuously improve my knowledge or gain new insights on the field. At some point, I started further engaging myself with SIOP, the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology. Interestingly enough, that happened all through Twitter. I was on Twitter, and there was someone who had posted a comment about, hey, we're trying to engage high school students with IO psychology. I'm like, hey, well, I work with high school students. I'm like, I didn't even think about how I can further engage them into the content. So I joined the Bridge Builders, which is basically a subcommittee of the Education and Training Committee. And our goal is to educate students and educators on IO psychology. So we're really trying to embed IO psychology into advanced placement psychology, intro psych courses, business courses, because we see the value in the subject matter. Whether you decide to pursue an undergraduate degree in psychology, whether you decide to pursue a graduate degree in psychology, we all work, or we're all going to work at some point or another. When we look at the data, we spend roughly 1/3 of our lives working. So what better way to kind of help prepare or kind of move the ball along in terms of career development than exposing students to the psychology of work, or the psychology of the workplace. So that's really our goal as a committee. And then this past year, my colleague and I, who's also an IO psychology practitioner, decided to really embed IO psychology into higher education administration. So throughout my entire career, I've seen the need for IO psychology in higher education administration in terms of how policies are developed, how employees sometimes are treated, different practices. So right now, the big thing in higher education, kind of across industries, is remote work, right? And there's this notion that employees are more productive if they're physically at the workplace. And the data may or may not suggest that. There's certain data out there in terms of creativity and its application to remote work, but it's not the most, it doesn't paint the best picture about the environment. So kind of looking at those situations. So my colleague and I thought about, hey, why don't we organize something to get individuals in higher education, specifically CUNY, because that's where we have kind of connections and access to start thinking about IO practices so we can make CUNY as a workplace better. So we came up with the CUNY IO Practitioners Network, which we started this past spring. And since then, we've held several presentations with IO psychologists or practitioners talking about various topics. So talking about, how do you lead virtual teams? How do you have effective remote meetings? How do you do effective DEI strategies on campus? How to become an effective evidence-based practitioner? And our goal is to get these higher ed administrators to start thinking about the science of work and hopefully embed it into their work functions. So that's kind of the path that took me to higher education. It's something that if you would have told me when I was an undergrad, hey, you're going to be in higher ed, I was like, not going to happen. I'm going to be in corporate. I'm going to be in HR. But I don't regret the path that kind of I ended up taking at all. It's been a great path, still a great path. And it's been one that I've been able to apply IO psychology in various degrees, whether, again, it's been through hiring staff members, hiring faculty members, and ensuring that those processes are as effective as possible in terms of training and development, and just different areas within higher education administration. Now, in terms of my typical day, I outlined a typical month because I don't think there's been a typical day or month for the most part. There's certain responsibilities or things that I tend to do on a somewhat regular basis. So communicating with internal and external stakeholders. When I was in career services, that was working with different departments on campus, working with employers. In my current role, it's working with high schools, CBOs or community-based organizations, CUNY Central, individuals on campus, so faculty members, academic units, facilitating presentations for students who are interested in our programming, evaluating program data. So whether it's looking at data based off of faculty evaluations to see if we're going to keep a faculty member, or if we have to make some changes, or looking at programmatic data. So for example, this past year for our STEM Research Academy, one of the programs that we have, we looked at career readiness. So we assess students on different areas of career readiness. And we found that the spring program didn't really help the students with the career readiness components that we wanted to. So that's something that we're going to come back for this upcoming spring and make the necessary changes and see how we can better embed career readiness. Reviewing applications every semester, strategic planning, whether that's at a department level or a CUNY level, because the program that I help manage is a CUNY-wide initiative. Planning professional development opportunities, either for my staff member or individuals across CUNY through the CUNY IO Practitioners Network, and a lot of emails. Most of the communication that takes place in my role is via email and some via phone call, whether that's with students, high schools, principals, or different stakeholders. That said, the role is really going to dictate what that quote unquote typical day, typical week, or typical month is going to look like. Depending on the department's mission, department size, you could possibly have more responsibilities, you can have less responsibilities. But one thing that I will say of higher education is that it allows you to collaborate with various units. So unlike a lot of corporate roles or HR roles where you're kind of focusing on your area of HR, organizational development, or whatever the case is, you really have an opportunity to collaborate with different departments. So I collaborated with different academic departments, so like psychology, history, communications, things like that. I've had the opportunity to collaborate with departments such as freshman seminar, the diversity office on the college. So it's really an opportunity to kind of see what other units are doing within the institution, and it gives you a better perspective of how higher education operates. Some organizations in corporate America do allow for this, but it's not necessarily the norm. And I feel like that is the norm when it comes to higher education administration. In terms of why you might want to consider higher education as a potential career path, that's one of them. The other thing is I firmly believe it's an industry in need of evidence-based workplace practices. So there's a lot of opportunity to apply IO theory, research, and practice. When it comes to higher education, I don't want to say that it's not evidence-based, but when it comes to workplace practices, I tend to see more of an emphasis on best practices. And best practices are not the same as evidence-based practices. When it comes to best practices, it's really looking at, hey, what are other departments, what are other institutions doing, and is that working for them? And more often than not, just kind of taking what they're doing and applying it to your department or unit. And as any IO practitioner will tell you, you can't take something from somewhere and just implant it somewhere else. There's always going to be deviations. There's going to be things that work at, let's say, Harvard, they're not going to work at CUNY for various reasons. It can be resources, et cetera. When it comes to evidence-based practices, it's looking at multiple sources of information, the research, information that your institution produces, looking at information as a practitioner. What are your experiences? But then critically judging those those evidences before you make a decision, right? And oftentimes that requires you collecting more data to make sure that it's actually going to apply or going to be effective in your unit or for what purpose that you have. And as I mentioned before, it's great access to information and resources that you may or may not otherwise have, especially if IO psychology is something that you're really passionate about and you want to make sure that you stay up to date with your field. And that the same could be for any other area, even developmental psych. If you work in higher education, there's going to be areas where you can apply developmental psychology to the role that you have. Obviously, there's going to be some roles where you can apply a bit more than others. But with IO, again, it's a psychology of work. There's application to anything and everything. It's just a matter of to what degree. And then, before I kind of open it up for questions, I want to make sure I highlight some free student resources through Bridge Builders Committee. We've curated a very extensive list of resources, both for educators and students. So this includes content summaries on different areas of IO psychology, occupational health psych, organizational development, leadership, group work, teamwork, things like that. Information on grad school, if you're currently pursuing your undergraduate degree and you're not sure if you want to pursue a degree in IO psych. A student newsletter, information on career paths. One thing that I will say about the career paths tool, if you look at the information that even SIOP provides, higher ed administration is oftentimes overlooked. So the area of SIOP that they tend to focus mostly on when it comes to academia is becoming a professor. So, full-time tenure track professor where you're teaching and conducting research. And any type of administrative role that they focus on tends to be for those who've been professors, being the president of a college, the VP, and so forth. So again, higher education administration is an area that's oftentimes overlooked even by the top branches of IO psychology, but it's a great career path. Information on SIOP's income and employment report. So this report highlights the average salaries for individuals with a master's degree versus a doctoral degree in IO psychology. What type of careers do each group pursue? What states have the most job opportunities for IO psychology? There's videos, various podcasts. There's numerous podcasts out there on IO psychology. All of them are great. And also access to free research summaries and articles. So I would definitely encourage all of you to take a look at the information on our link tree, whether you're currently pursuing your undergraduate degree or your graduate degree. I think it's going to be extremely beneficial for your professional development. And again, whether you want to pursue a career in IO psychology or not, it'll help you get a better understanding of different dynamics that take place in the workplace and how you can kind of approach those situations. So we'll decide to open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much. If you have questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. Some of you submitted them beforehand, so we'll go ahead and take those as well. We'll move between both. So one of the questions that was submitted asks, provided that we are in the middle of the Great Resignation, as they're calling it, and the widespread reimagining of the workplace, as an IO psychology practitioner, how do you think organizations are falling short? And what should they begin adopting or unlearning to attract and retain junior talent?
I think that's a great question. The first thing I will say is, with respect to the Great Resignation, I'm somewhat skeptical. I'm not necessarily sure if this is actually happening or not. I would argue that it's occurring in certain industries, but across the board, I haven't necessarily seen data to suggest that it's something that's happening across the board. So I will say that. In terms of what organizations can do to better attract talent or even do better by their current employees, is really focusing on resources that highlight employee mental health. Right. So a big thing that oftentimes gets talked about is burnout. And I think even with the pandemic, it's been spoken about more so than ever. The times that I've seen information or articles on the supposed Great Resignation, there's been a highlight of burnout. That said, when we look at burnout, we oftentimes have a misconception of what it is, especially employers or organizations. Organizations think that just by saying, hey, take a day off, you're miraculously going to be healed from any mental health concerns or issues that you may be facing. And that's not necessarily the case. When we look at the research behind burnout, it's really due to a variety of organizational factors. Some of those factors can be lack of resources, too much work, expecting your employees to be overextended, right? Let's say your job is from 9 to 5, but you're expected to be answering emails at 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night, even though it's outside of your work scope or outside of your work hours. Those type of expectations contribute to burnout. So I think organizations have to be really mindful of how they approach mental health first and foremost. And secondly, what type of resources are you providing to your employees? What type of how are you treating your employees? We have this concept called psychological safety. Are your employees able to voice their opinion or concerns without being reprimanded or without being criticized? So I think more often than not, at least in my perspective, especially when we're looking at it from an IO perspective, but also from an occupational health psych perspective, is, are you really focusing on your employees? And I think if organizations truly and genuinely appreciate and value their employees, they'll do everything necessary, because whether the business case has been made, and the business case is the bottom line, is the organization going to generate more revenues? Even if the business case is not directly met, there's indirect benefits to making sure that your employees are treated well. So obviously when we look at the data, there's weak direct relationships between, let's say, making sure that your employees are appreciated and performance, but they're indirectly connected, right? It may be that your employees happy now. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be more productive, but they may be more loyal. They may engage in organizational citizenship behaviors. They may be willing to answer that email at 6 o'clock, right? There's other benefits that aren't always as tangible as organizations would like them to be.
Mm-hmm. Great. Someone asked a question in the chat. How did you know that higher education administration was for you when you first accepted that first position, especially given that it wasn't a well-known area for IO psychologists to go into as a career?
So I will say I didn't know at all. I applied to the CUNY CAP program with the goal of it's going to pay for my master's degree, right? I'm going to have my master's degree paid for, and I'm going to go to corporate. It was more so through the experience, the hands-on experience itself, that I started thinking like, okay, I'm actually applying IO to higher ed, but I still had tunnel vision, even while I was working at the Career Development Center while completing my graduate degree, where I'm still going to go in corporate. It wasn't really until I got my full-time, I say full-time kind of tenure position, if you want to think about it that way, because within CUNY specifically, after you have a certain number of years in a particular position, you get tenured even as an administrator. So it wasn't until I got into that line, it's called the HERO series, that I started thinking like, you know what, higher ed might be a good career path just to stay in. So I really, again, started finding ways or making sure I can consciously apply IO psychology to the work that I was doing. But in the very beginning, that wasn't the case. The mindset was, I'm here, this is a stepping stone to get to somewhere else. But like they say, the rest is history. I've stayed in higher ed ever since, and I do not see myself leaving anytime soon and or ever.
So someone asked, so what are some entry-level jobs that someone could apply to that will give them relevant experience for their future career in IO if they decide to, go for a master's? Where should they start?
I see, that's a somewhat difficult question. I think that the general answer is always start finding HR-related internships. The one thing that you will find is that you will barely, if ever, find an opportunity that says IO psychology intern or something with IO psychology in it, unless it's for someone with a doctorate degree and it's going to be in the government, working for the federal government. They want someone who's an IO psychologist. So you have to start really thinking about what type of areas of the workplace are you interested in? Are you interested in training and development? Are you interested in recruiting and selection? Are you interested in XYZ? And start trying to find internship opportunities in those areas. Because I will tell you this, from firsthand experience and from working in career services, a degree is a check mark for employers. What they want are concrete skills. So your KSAOs, that's really what employers are looking for. So, you can get a graduate degree, you can get a doctorate in IO psych in any discipline, but if you don't have relevant work experience, it's going to be very difficult to find a job or a career path. So it's critical to start identifying or building those experiences early on. Whether they're 100% relevant to what your long-term goals are or not isn't necessarily important. It's important in the sense of you can start eliminating areas that you're not interested in, or you might say, hey, you know what? I had this internship and we focus on recruiting and selection. I really like this area. This is what I want to go into. Or you might say, I don't want to do this. I want to focus on a different area of the workplace. So it helps in that aspect. But getting those experiences are critical. I think it's a matter of looking for those opportunities and then really looking at the job description. Don't go based off of the title alone, because the title can tell you very little or it can tell you nothing at all. But usually, again, the response is always try to find HR-related opportunities, because those tend to be a bit more concrete in its application of IO psychology.
So someone asked a very focused question about a specific area. So as someone who's working in the direct service space, helping first-generation college students discover their ideal career and get hired, in what ways would a master's level education in IO enhance their ability to deliver on those outcomes?
Yeah, so when you pursue your undergraduate degree, there's a lot of information that you're being exposed to, which is great, but it's little bit tidbits and little pieces of a bigger picture or of a particular field of study. When you pursue your graduate degree, you're really focusing on the field itself, right? So, for example, I got my degree in psychology from Baruch. I took courses in IO, but when I pursued my master's degree, all the courses were IO specific. So whether it was looking at individuals in the organization, looking at training and development, looking at organizational behavior. So you really start getting a kind of a better picture of the field and also its application to different areas of the workplace. So not necessarily industries per se, but of different areas in the workplace. You can focus on your I, the industrial side. So focusing on the recruiting, the selection. You can look at the O, the more big picture organization-wide factors, looking at teams, looking at culture, organizational climate. For myself in particular, when I pursued my master's degree, Brooklyn College actually had a track. So you can choose either the I or the O. I went more towards the O because I tend to be more big picture. I like the organizational culture stuff, organizational change, looking at groups rather than an individual. So even with my kind of assisting students, whether it's high school or undergraduate students in terms of finding occupations, I tend to look at it more big picture. How can I help this group of students kind of be more conscientious about their career path? How can I help this group of individuals to develop the necessary skills that they need to go into the career path that they want?
So someone you started to actually address this next question. The person wanted to know, they're curious about specialties or focuses within IO that are possible with a master's degree.
So there's a lot of areas. And again, you can focus on either the I or the O or both. Usually it all narrows down to either your interests or where you kind of start setting your feet in when it comes to industry experience. So whether it's, again, training and development, you can look at bigger pictures in terms of when it comes to consulting and going into organizations, assessing kind of any challenges they may be facing, and then coming up with a plan to make the necessary changes. That in itself has its own frustrations, right? Because you can come in as a consultant and say, hey, this is the problem. It's not necessarily what you think it is. This is kind of an action plan that we should implement. And organizational leaders can say, okay, that's great, but no, right? Or you can just focus on very specific areas. So developing talent within an organization, whether it's making sure that they're better trained, and helping with the onboarding process so that your new employees know what the culture is like, right? Have a firsthand experience as to what they should expect on the job. But when it comes to your degree, you're getting a general idea of all those aspects. You won't get the very specific nitty-gritty details until you start your work experience.
So someone asked about, this idea that the developmental and IO psychology areas seem like rather distinct branches of the field, and that's correct. They are. They want to know if you're aware of any careers that might bridge the two in any way, or do you experience any of these kinds of bridges in your day-to-day work?
With respect to developmental and myself, I'm sure I engage in kind of developmental psych related aspects without knowing it. Because at the end of the day, psychology is all interrelated. If you look at IO psychology, it's really an application of social psych, personality psych, and other areas of psychology to kind of just apply it to the workplace. That's really what it is. One area that I can think of specifically, which focuses on development, and you can kind of relate it back to IO psychology, is looking at adult development as it relates to career paths. How do people formulate their career paths over time? Whether it's from, you're going to college, that's part of your career path. You're getting education and training, focusing on a profession, then getting your work experiences and kind of going into more experiences, and then ultimately retiring. What is the impact of your development over time when it comes to all these things? Even when we look at, again, the supposed concept of generational differences, when we look at the data, any difference can really be explained by period effects. So things that happen in society that impact everyone, 9/11, for example, the pandemic, these are things that impacted everyone. Doesn't matter if you were 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 60, 80, whatever. It impacted everyone in different degrees, but it impacted everyone. Or age effects. Young people, for the most part, tend to be more narcissistic, right? So if you were 18 in 1920, 18 in 2002, 18 in 2020, you were all narcissistic for the most part. Again, it's a generalization, but it's an age thing. So again, that's an area that you can kind of overlap developmental aspects with IO psychology. How do these different age groups? So in IO psychology, we never talk about generational groups. We tend to talk about age groups in the workplace. What's the impact in the workplace?
Mm-hmm. So someone asked, as you mentioned, applying evidence-based practices in the industry, what do you imagine to be the next evolution of IO psychology will be?
I would probably say that the next evolution is evidence-based practice, only because one, the scientist practitioner gap that I mentioned before, where oftentimes you can be a master's level practitioner and kind of lose the focus on the research because your work is being dictated by, industry. And industry needs are oftentimes very different from what research presents or what research is saying. And then secondly, you can be someone who has a PhD, you're conducting research in IO psychology, but you're not focusing necessarily on what is considered evidence-based practice because they're focusing on research-based practices. What is the research alone indicating? But evidence-based practice is really a combination of the research, organizational data, experiences from practitioners, and other sources, and looking at all that data to make a decision, an informed decision. And it takes time, right? Because you're looking at different sources of data. So if anything, I would say it's maybe like data analytics, because you're looking at all these different types of data from different areas, and then you have to try and analyze it and look at it to try and make an informed decision. So if anything, evidence-based practice is really, I think, the next step for IO psychology, but also data analytics kind of in conjunction with that.
So this person asked, what KSAOs do you think are the most important ones to develop as master's students if we want to work in higher education administration? And I hope everyone saw that I did put what KSAOs are, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term.
It's hard to pinpoint specific KSAOs just because, as I mentioned before, roles, responsibilities, and tasks are going to vary depending on the department you're in, how big the department is, what the goal or the mission of the department is. But if you want to look at kind of more general KSAOs or things that you should, or competencies that you should focus on, you can look up NACE, which is National Association of Colleges and Employers. They've identified specific competencies that employers across industries want individuals to have. So leadership skills, communication skills. These are skills that are easily transferable regardless of what industry you want to go into. When it goes to higher education, one could argue having an understanding of how higher education operates. Having never taken a course in higher ed admin, I developed that throughout my work experience. I think I'm fairly confident I know exactly how higher education operates and how administration within higher education operates without never having taken a course. On the flip side, my wife, her degree is in higher education administration. So she took the courses on understanding how higher education is funded, how things operate, why they operate the things the way that they do. I learned on the job ultimately. So there's definitely things that you can learn on the job. But I think what's most critical is looking at those general transferable skills. And then depending on the specific area you want to go to, identifying specific KSOs relevant to that. So, career services, things that are more relevant to that than maybe another area of higher ed would be, counseling or understanding of counseling, or understanding of coaching, training and development, which may or may not be 100% more applicable to, let's say, working in the bursar's office, which deals with money. But you can still apply IO psychology even in a role within the bursar because there's people working in the department, right? And we want to make sure that there's good team dynamics within that department, or that the employees in that department are happy. So there's still a way to apply it, but the specific day-to-day functioning is going to be very different.
So this question came in actually both in the chat and in our pre-submitted questions. So a more general but important question. When should someone pursue a PhD in IO versus a master's in IO?
So I would say, even with respect to pursuing a master's in general, you want to make sure that you have a quote unquote good reason for pursuing a master's. If your reason is I'm pursuing a graduate degree for the sake of furthering my education, that's fine. If you want to pursue a graduate degree for the sake of it's going to help me grow professionally, fine. But never go for something of just because I should do it. That's not a good enough reason. I think it's something that's you're going to devote time and effort to. So you really have to be mindful of, is this something I want to go into? There are plenty of careers, whether you're focusing on psychology or not, that one can get with a bachelor's degree. So let me put it out there. You don't need a master's degree in life to succeed, right? It's really if you want to kind of further enhance your understanding of a particular topic or go into specific fields that require it. So with respect to IO psychology, one, for the most part, would not be considered an IO practitioner unless you minimum have a master's degree, right? And that's at least kind of the understanding that the industry has. You need to have a better understanding of our theories, research, and practice, and how you can apply it. In terms of PhD versus master's, I think it really depends on what your ultimate goals are. So for example, I decided to pursue my master's degree and opted not to get a doctorate because my goal was to be more of a practitioner. While I've conducted research, it's not my primary goal. And nor is my primary goal being a professor, teaching all day. Yes, I teach at SPS, I teach at Baruch every so often, but my job is as a practitioner. That's my primary goal. And then the other things are secondary. So that was my goal. I didn't see a need to pursue a PhD for what I'm in right now. And even if I decided to go into HR at that time, I didn't see it necessary for what I wanted to do to pursue a PhD. Now, if you like research, you want to be a researcher, you want to conduct data for organizations, then a PhD might be something you want to focus on. The big difference between the PhD and the master's is that for the PhD, there's going to be a huge focus on the research component, conducting the research, not just utilizing it. For the master's level, it tends to be more about, yes, conducting some research so you know what research entails, but it's more about consumption of research. So depending if you want to be a producer or a consumer, I think that's a big thing to consider. That said, IO psychology is one of those fields that even with a PhD in IO psych, you can go and become a practitioner and have nothing to do with academia. I have plenty of colleagues who are IO psychologists who work in industry and they don't teach, they don't conduct research. Or they don't conduct research in terms of how we think of it in higher education, but they're doing data related functions for, let's say, the NYPD or the federal government, or they're analyzing programs. And I think for them, it was really a matter of they genuinely enjoy school. They wanted to really become experts in IO psychology. And they thought that what they would learn from a PhD program would be something that they can apply to their career path. But it's something that I think you don't take very lightly. Take the time to really think about it. And sometimes it could be a matter of, you know what, I'm going to pursue a master's first, and at least that'll give me some extra time to think about if I want to pursue a PhD. And there's some PhD programs out there that will actually take your master's credits. Don't quote me on this 100%, but I know back in the day, Hofstra University would only accept students into their PhD program if they had a master's. So it was basically, you get your master's, we'll basically take those credits, and then you do extra years to complete your PhD. And then other programs have en route masters where you get accepted into the PhD program. After 2 years of your coursework and so forth, you get your master's degree. And then some students decide to just say, hey, you know what, I did this, but I'm just gonna stay with the master's, and the others continue on.
Great. So someone asked a really great reflective question, which is, and this might be the last question that we have time for, and we'll see if we can squeeze one more in, but the question is, how has the industry changed since you started?
The sad part is, I would say not much. As I mentioned before, I think higher ed administration is a great field for IO practitioners, IO psychologists, because I think it's in dire need, in my personal opinion, of our theories, research, and practice. Since I started in higher ed, I haven't really seen many things change. From when I started to today, I still have those moments where I'm just kind of like, why? Like, this doesn't make any sense from an IO perspective, right? In terms of making decisions where you don't engage the employees or the people within your department, and just the higher up just making a decision that will impact those employees. And I say that because, individuals who are in administrative positions for the most part, or in leadership positions within higher ed, don't have IO backgrounds. So that, as much as they're trained in, whatever their discipline is, they've had work experiences. It's not a focus on all the dynamics that take place in the workplace. And unless you're focusing on that, sometimes it's very hard to kind of see what you may be doing correctly, or kind of focusing on a different field that's not yours, right? Oftentimes, if you're a president of a college, it's not yes, I'm sure some of them have backgrounds in higher ed admin as a profession, in terms of their academics, but sometimes they have degrees in literature. And I'm not trying to knock anyone, but the experiences that they've gained have been throughout the years, right? Getting that experience and getting that experience, you may have been doing something correctly, you may not have been doing something correctly in your experiences. So when we look at it from kind of what the data indicates or suggests, we're able to say, well, when we look at these, this data, that's not the proper approach. But sometimes we can get caught up on how we do things and think that we're correct. And that happens to IOs as well, right? I know there's IOs out there who are very adamant on generational labels, and I'm adamant against them. I know there's individuals in career services who are very adamant about using the Myers-Briggs type indicator. When I look at the research, it basically, putting it nicely, it's baloney. There's better assessments to look at personality. So again, it's very easy to kind of fall into the industry and kind of what the industry promotes. They're victims of the industry, to put it nicely. So nothing's really changed in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So I think we'll end with, I think we could squeeze in one more, and I think this is a nice way to end, which is, what do you love the most about your work?
Specifically, I would probably say is when I'm able to make an impact on a student or someone's life. So even for my time in career services, it was really helping students who, from looking at kind of their family circle, maybe they're the first ones to go to college, right? And through Baruch's on-campus recruiting program, we were able to help facilitate. I never say I helped a student get a job, helped facilitate that process. They were able to get that job with, let's say, Bank of America's, as most of you know, Baruch College is very heavy on business, specifically finance and accounting. And starting out of undergrad, they were making $60,000, $70,000, which was a lot more than maybe their whole family income, right? Kind of helping them through that is amazing. Right now with high school students, having them even consider college. Sometimes we'll have students like, I don't really want to go to college. I'm like, take a free class, don't knock it till you try it, right? And sometimes it's kind of that aha moment, like, wow, you're right, this was great. I have so much freedom that I don't have in high school. So kind of that makes it worthwhile. On the flip side, kind of more IO, when I'm able to get one of my colleagues to think about something differently, again, kind of those commonly held myths, or if I'm able to say, there's no real reason that we should be in the office 5 days a week, right? If you want to look at it from kind of the pandemic's perspective, and really having people kind of look at the other side and kind of the research and be like, wow, you're right. Or, you make a very good point. That's something we should definitely be taking into consideration. And I think that goes a long way to kind of helping everyone. So whether it's the students or just our colleagues in general.
Great, thank you. And thank you again, Professor Diaz, for being with us tonight, for presenting and for answering all of these wonderful questions. It's been an honor to have you here. We're so grateful for you participating, and also to all of you for joining us this evening. Thank you. And if you have additional questions that you are just dying to ask, feel free to send them to me. I'll put my email address in the chat. Some of you already have it. And if it's something specifically for Professor Diaz, I'm happy to pass it along to him. And we'll get those questions answered for you. But take care, and we hope you join us for our next round of series that will be in the spring. Again, we have a dev and an IO talk all the time, and we're lucky enough to have Professor Diaz at SPS. So keep an eye out for him on the schedule, and you can take a class with him and get to work with him a little bit more. So thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a good night.